I never thought one comment at a dinner party could destroy my entire life. Looking back now, I can see how everything unraveled from that single moment when I mentioned that my ex Marcus made more money than my husband David. At the time, it seemed like such an innocent observation, maybe even helpful motivation for David to push himself harder in his career. But that night changed everything. What started as what I thought was constructive feedback turned into David packing his bags and our entire family turning against me. Everyone acts like I'm this terrible person, but they don't understand the full picture. They don't know how lonely I'd been feeling, how David had become so distant and unmotivated, or how desperately I needed someone to actually see me and appreciate what I bring to a relationship. I'm not trying to make excuses for what happened. Afterward, the choices I made with Marcus, the way things spiraled out of control. But I need people to understand that I didn't set out to hurt anyone. I was just a woman who felt invisible in her own marriage, trying to find some happiness and validation after years of feeling like I was slowly disappearing. Maybe if David had been more present, more ambitious, more like the man I thought I was, marrying, none of this would have happened. Maybe if he had actually listened when I tried to encourage him, instead of shutting down every time I mentioned how other people were succeeding in their careers. Maybe if our friends and family had supported me through the difficult period in my marriage, instead of immediately taking his side. All I know is that one dinner party comment somehow led to me losing my husband, my home, and apparently everyone I thought cared about me. And now they're all acting like I'm the villain in this story, when really, I was just trying to survive in a marriage that had been slowly suffocating me for years. The dinner party at Jake and Michelle's house was supposed to be a nice evening out. We hadn't socialized with friends in months, and I was really looking forward to adult conversation and feeling like part of a couple again instead of just going through the motions at home. I'd bought a new dress specifically for the occasion. Nothing too fancy, but something that made me feel attractive and confident for the first time in ages. David seemed tired before we even left the house, which immediately put me on edge. I'd spent all afternoon getting ready and making sure Lily was settled with David's mother for the evening, and he couldn't even pretend to be excited about spending time with our friends. When Jake asked him about work, David just shrugged and gave some vague answer about budget cuts at the school district. When Michelle complimented the wine we'd brought, David barely acknowledged her thanks. I found myself overcompensating for his mood, laughing a little too loudly at jokes and trying to keep the conversation flowing. But I could feel everyone noticing how withdrawn he was, how he kept checking his phone and seemed completely disengaged from everything happening around him. It was embarrassing, honestly. Here I was trying to be social and connected, and my own husband was making us both look antisocial. That's when the conversation turned to career changes and people we knew who were doing well professionally. Michelle mentioned running into my ex Marcus at the grocery store and how successful his marketing firm had become since his divorce. She said he'd just bought some expensive house in the hills and seemed really happy with how his life was turning out. I don't know what came over me, but I found myself saying that Marcus had always been ambitious like that, always pushing himself to earn more and achieve bigger things. I mentioned how much more money he'd made than David even back when we were dating, and how he'd always encouraged me to want more out of life too. I thought I was just making conversation, maybe even giving David a gentle nudge to think about his own potential. But the moment the words left my mouth, I could feel the energy at the table shift completely. Jake and Michelle exchanged this uncomfortable look, and David went completely silent beside me. His face had this expression I'd never seen before. Not angry exactly, but something much colder and more distant. He wouldn't meet my eyes for the rest of the evening, barely spoke another word to anyone, and when I tried to touch his arm or include him in conversations, he just pulled away. The drive home was absolutely silent, not the comfortable quiet of a couple who'd had a nice evening together, but this heavy, tense silence that made my stomach twist with anxiety. I kept trying to start conversations about the dinner or our friends, but David just stared straight ahead at the road like I wasn't even there. When we got home, he went straight to the guest room without saying goodnight to me, or even checking on Lily like he usually did. I lay in our empty bed that night, wondering what I'd said that was so wrong. All I'd done was mention the truth about Marcus's success and maybe suggest that David could learn something from that kind of ambition. If anything, I thought I was being supportive by showing him what was possible if he just applied himself more. I couldn't understand why he was being so sensitive about something that was clearly meant to help motivate him toward better things. The next morning, David was already gone when I woke up. He'd made coffee, but only enough for himself, and there was no note or indication of when he'd be back. Lily asked why Daddy had slept in the other room, and I found myself making up some excuse about him having trouble sleeping and not wanting to disturb me. But even as I said it, I could see the confusion and worry in her 8-year-old eyes. When David finally came home that evening, I was determined to clear the air and get our relationship back on track. I'd spent the whole day thinking about what had happened at the dinner party, and I genuinely couldn't understand why he was so upset about what I'd said. I approached him in the kitchen while he was helping Lily with her homework, trying to keep my voice light and reasonable. I explained that I hadn't meant anything hurtful by my comments about Marcus. I told him I was just trying to point out examples of success and motivation that might inspire him to think bigger about his own career possibilities. I reminded him that he'd always talked about maybe getting his master's degree or looking into administrative positions, and that seeing what other people had accomplished could be a good push in that direction. But instead of understanding where I was coming from, David accused me of humiliating him in front of our friends. He said I'd made him sound like a failure compared to my ex-boyfriend, and that this wasn't the first time I'd made comments that undermined him publicly. He brought up other occasions when I'd supposedly embarrassed him, times when I'd mentioned other people's promotions or new cars or vacations, times when I'd encouraged him to be more social or ambitious. I tried to explain that everything I'd ever said came from a place of love and wanting the best for our family. I pointed out that his teaching salary barely covered our expenses, that we never went anywhere or did anything fun anymore, and that maybe a little motivation from someone who cared about him wasn't such a terrible thing. I asked him why he was being so sensitive about honest observations that were clearly meant to help him grow. That's when he really lost it. David told me that my idea of help felt like constant criticism, that I'd been making him feel inadequate for years, and that he was tired of feeling like nothing he did was ever good enough for me. He said he'd been working extra hours tutoring students just to try to bring in more money, but that apparently even that wasn't enough to earn my respect or appreciation. The argument escalated from there, with both of us saying things we probably shouldn't have. I ended up telling him that maybe if he'd shown half the drive and ambition that Marcus had, we wouldn't be having these problems. I pointed out that other wives didn't have to worry about money or feel embarrassed about their husband's lack of career progress the way I did. David's response was to tell me that if I was so unhappy with him and our life together, maybe I should go, find someone who could give me whatever it was I thought I deserved. Then he grabbed his pillow from our bedroom and went back to the guest room, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen feeling frustrated and completely misunderstood. Over the next few days, David barely spoke to me except when absolutely necessary. He handled all of Lily's needs without asking for my help, made his own meals, and spent most of his time either at work or grading papers in the guest room. When his mother called to check on us, I could hear him having long, quiet conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I walked into the room. I started noticing that he was texting someone frequently. His phone would buzz constantly in the evenings, and he'd check it immediately every time. When I asked who he was talking to so much, he just said it was work stuff and changed the subject. But teachers don't usually get that many work texts at 10 o'clock at night, and the secretive way he handled his phone made me increasingly suspicious and worried about what was really going on. The final straw came when I was looking for a pen in his desk drawer and found a business card for a divorce attorney tucked underneath some old bills. My hands were shaking as I read the name and phone number, realizing that while I'd been trying to repair our relationship and help him understand my perspective, David had apparently been planning to end our marriage entirely. Finding that divorce lawyer's card sent me into a complete panic. I couldn't believe David was seriously considering ending our marriage over one comment at a dinner party and a few honest conversations about our future. I felt like I was losing control of everything in my life, and I desperately needed someone to talk to who would understand what I was going through. That's when I started thinking about Marcus more seriously. I'd always known he worked as a substitute teacher at Lily's school occasionally, filling in for teachers who were out sick or on leave. He'd actually been Lily's substitute for a few weeks the previous year when her regular teacher had surgery, and Lily had always spoken fondly of how fun and engaging he made the lessons. I found myself lingering at school pickup, hoping to run into him and maybe strike up a casual conversation. When I finally did see him in the hallway one afternoon, he was warm and friendly, in a way that reminded me immediately of why I'd been attracted to him years ago. He asked how I was doing, seemed genuinely interested in my answer, and mentioned that he'd heard through mutual friends that David and I were going through a rough patch. We ended up talking for almost an hour in the school parking lot, while Lily played on the playground. Marcus listened sympathetically as I explained how David had become distant and unmotivated, how he'd overreacted to my attempts to encourage him, and how alone I'd been feeling in my marriage. Marcus understood completely. He'd just gone through his own divorce the year before, and knew exactly what it felt like to be with someone who didn't appreciate or support your dreams. He suggested we continue our conversation over coffee sometime, and I found myself saying yes immediately. It felt so good to talk to someone who actually listened to me and validated my feelings, instead of making me feel like I was asking too much or being unreasonable. Marcus remembered things about me that David seemed to have forgotten. My love of art museums, my dream of maybe going back to school someday. Little details that made me feel seen and valued as an individual person. Our coffee meeting turned into a 3-hour conversation that left me feeling more energized and hopeful than I had in months. Marcus told me about his successful marketing firm, the house he'd just bought, and his plans for expanding his business into new markets. He was everything I remembered him being: ambitious, confident, successful, and genuinely interested in making something meaningful of his life. More importantly, he made me remember who I used to be before I got bogged down in the daily routine of marriage and motherhood. He reminded me that I'd once had dreams and ambitions too, that I'd been planning to go back to school for my master's degree before Lily came along and everything got so complicated. He asked thoughtful questions about my job at the insurance company and actually listened when I talked about the cases I worked on. I started looking forward to our conversations more than anything else in my week. Marcus would text me during the day asking how things were going, and I'd find myself sharing details about my life that I couldn't talk to David about anymore. When David was being particularly cold or distant, Marcus would remind me that I deserved to be with someone who appreciated me and wanted to build a real future together. I began spending more time getting ready in the mornings, buying new clothes that made me feel attractive and confident again. I started missing some of our usual family dinners, telling David I had to work late or meet with friends, when really I was having long conversations with Marcus at coffee shops or restaurants around town. David seemed too wrapped up in his own issues to notice or care much about the changes in my routine. Marcus made me feel like the person I'd always wanted to be: sophisticated, interesting, worthy of attention and romance. When he started suggesting that maybe David and I weren't as compatible as we'd once thought, and that perhaps I'd simply outgrown a relationship that was holding me back from my real potential, his words felt like validation of everything I'd been feeling for months. The afternoon he kissed me in his car, after we'd had lunch together, I should have pulled away immediately. I should have remembered my marriage vows and my responsibility to Lily and David. But in that moment, all I could think about was how long it had been since someone had wanted me that way. How good it felt to be desired and appreciated by someone who actually saw my worth. So instead of stopping him, I kissed him back and felt alive for the first time in years. After that first kiss, everything changed between Marcus and me. What had started as innocent conversations and emotional support quickly became something much more intense and complicated. Marcus began texting me constantly throughout the day, sending sweet messages that made me feel desired and special in ways I'd almost forgotten were possible. He invited me to see his new house, and I found myself making excuses to David about having to work late or run errands that would take several hours. Marcus's place was everything I'd dreamed of having: modern, spacious, decorated with expensive furniture and art that showed real taste and sophistication. He'd clearly put thought and money into creating a space that reflected success and ambition, unlike our cramped house with its outdated kitchen and furniture we'd bought years ago when money was even tighter. Being with Marcus felt like stepping into the life I should have been living all along. He took me to restaurants I'd only heard about, places where David would have complained about the prices before we even sat down. He bought wine that cost more than our weekly grocery budget and didn't seem to think twice about it. When I mentioned admiring a piece of jewelry or a dress I saw while we were out together, he'd surprise me with it the next time we met. I started keeping these gifts hidden in my car or at work, telling myself I wasn't really doing anything wrong, since David had been so cold and distant anyway. Marcus understood that my marriage had been essentially over for months, that David and I were just going through the motions for Lily's sake. He never pressured me to leave David immediately, but he made it clear that he was ready for something real and serious when I was ready to make that choice. The physical side of our relationship developed naturally from all the emotional intimacy we'd been building. Marcus made me feel beautiful and wanted in ways I hadn't experienced in years. With David, intimacy had become routine and infrequent, something we did out of obligation rather than genuine desire. But with Marcus, everything felt passionate and exciting again, like I was rediscovering parts of myself that had been dormant for too long. I became expert at managing my double life, scheduling my time with Marcus around David's work schedule and Lily's activities. I'd meet Marcus for lunch during my break at work, or we'd spend afternoons together when David was tutoring students and Lily was at after-school programs. I told myself I was being careful and responsible, that no one was getting hurt as long as I kept everything compartmentalized. But maintaining the deception became increasingly stressful. As David grew more suspicious about my changed behavior, he started asking more questions about where I'd been and who I'd been with, and I found myself having to remember elaborate lies about coworkers and errands and appointments. When he noticed I'd been buying new clothes and seemed happier and more energetic than I'd been in months, I told him I'd been making an effort to take better care of myself and focus on my own well-being. David's mother, Margaret, noticed the changes, too, during one of her weekly visits. She commented on my new hairstyle and the expensive-looking earrings I was wearing, asking if we'd gotten some kind of windfall or bonus that she hadn't heard about. I laughed it off and said I'd just been treating myself to a few nice things, but I could see her studying my face with that knowing look mothers-in-law sometimes get when they sense something isn't quite right. My sister Sophie also started making comments about how different I seemed, how I was always checking my phone and smiling at messages, how I'd been missing family gatherings and seemed distracted when I did show up. When she asked directly if everything was okay with David and me, I told her we were working through some issues, but that things were getting better. I couldn't exactly explain that I was finding happiness and fulfillment outside my marriage without opening a conversation I wasn't ready to have. The hardest part was watching David handle more and more of Lily's daily care without complaint. He was the one helping with homework every night, making her breakfast, driving her to activities, and handling bedtime routines. When I was late getting home or distracted during family time, he just quietly picked up the slack without making me feel guilty about it. Part of me appreciated that he wasn't making demands or creating conflict, but another part of me wished he'd fight for our relationship instead of just accepting that I was pulling away. Marcus kept reassuring me that what we had was special and worth protecting, that David's passivity just proved how little he truly valued me and our marriage. He pointed out that a man who really loved his wife would never let her drift away so easily, would never just retreat into silence instead of fighting to win her back. Marcus promised that once I was free from a relationship that was clearly making me unhappy, we could build something real and lasting together. The evening David confronted me with a receipt from an expensive restaurant I'd claimed I'd never been to, I knew my carefully constructed double life was starting to crumble. His voice was deadly calm when he asked who I'd really been with that Tuesday, and I could see in his eyes that he already suspected the answer. All my explanations about work events and client meetings sounded weak and unconvincing even to me. And I realized that no matter how careful I thought I'd been, the truth was finally catching up with all of us. David had been collecting evidence for weeks. When he finally presented it all to me in our living room that Sunday afternoon, I realized just how thoroughly my secret had been exposed. He had photographs of Marcus's car in various parking lots where I'd claimed to be running errands. He had credit card statements showing charges at restaurants and shops I'd sworn I'd never visited. He even had testimony from neighbors who'd seen me at Marcus's house on multiple occasions. I tried to minimize everything at first, explaining that Marcus and I were just friends going through similar marital problems and supporting each other through difficult times. I told David that he was reading too much into innocent friendship activities and that his suspicious, controlling behavior was exactly why I'd needed someone neutral to talk to in the first place. But David wasn't buying any of my explanations. He asked me directly if I was sleeping with Marcus, and when I hesitated too long before answering, he said my silence told him everything he needed to know. He accused me of having an affair for months, while he'd been trying desperately to save our marriage and keep our family together. That's when I finally admitted the truth, but tried to make David understand that it wasn't really my fault. I explained how lonely and neglected I'd been feeling, how his distance and lack of ambition had pushed me toward someone who actually appreciated me. I told him that Marcus represented everything I'd been hoping David would become: successful, attentive, willing to invest in a relationship and build something meaningful together. I begged David to understand that my relationship with Marcus had developed because of problems that already existed in our marriage, not because I'd set out to hurt anyone. I explained that if David had been meeting my emotional needs and showing the kind of drive and ambition that would have made our future feel secure, I never would have been vulnerable to someone like Marcus in the first place. David's mother arrived while we were still arguing, apparently having been called by David earlier that day. Margaret took one look at the evidence spread across our coffee table and immediately understood what was happening. Instead of staying neutral or trying to mediate between us, she stood firmly behind David and told me that I'd broken sacred vows and destroyed my family's trust in ways that couldn't be repaired. When my parents arrived an hour later, I hoped they'd help David understand my perspective and encourage him to work toward forgiveness and reconciliation. But even they seemed shocked by the extent of my deception and the callous way I was trying to justify months of lies and betrayal. My father kept shaking his head and asking how I could have risked everything we'd built together for someone who'd already proven he was willing to break up marriages. The worst part was when Lily came downstairs to see what all the shouting was about. She didn't understand the adult details of what was happening, but she could clearly sense that something terrible and permanent was occurring in our family. When she started crying and asking if Mommy and Daddy were getting divorced, I realized that my choices had consequences far beyond just David and me. David handed me divorce papers that he'd apparently had prepared weeks earlier. He told me I had 30 days to find somewhere else to live, and that his lawyer would be in touch about custody arrangements and division of assets. When I protested that he was being hasty and cruel, that we should try counseling or separation before jumping straight to divorce, he said that trust was something that couldn't be rebuilt after this level of betrayal and deception. I spent the next weeks desperately trying to salvage something from the wreckage. Marcus suddenly became distant and evasive when I called, claiming he needed time to think. When I pressed him about our future together, he said things were complicated and maybe we'd rushed into something neither of us was ready for. My parents tried to be supportive when I showed up crying at their house, but even they seemed uncomfortable with what I'd done. My mother kept asking why I'd thrown away a good marriage for someone who clearly wasn't serious about commitment, Sophie was more direct, telling me she'd watched David become a shell of himself while I was sneaking around, and that I should have tried counseling instead of jumping straight to infidelity. The custody arrangement gave me every other weekend with Lily, but I could see she was more comfortable with David. She kept asking why I'd made Daddy sad and when I was coming home to fix everything. Margaret made it clear I wasn't welcome at family gatherings anymore, and even David's friends had chosen his side. 2 weeks before I had to move out, Marcus told me he'd decided to reconcile with his ex-wife. He said their divorce had been a mistake, and he wanted to rebuild his family rather than start over with someone new. Just like that, the future I'd sacrificed everything for vanished completely. As I packed my belongings alone, I could hear David and Lily laughing together in the kitchen over her homework. The sound reminded me of normal family life before I destroyed it all. I'd lost my husband, my home, my daily relationship with my daughter, and everyone's respect, all for a relationship that disappeared the moment things got real. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city are you watching. Watching.